wants to keep your protein from crashing out on you, and if it does happen, here are some things you can do. So crash out is what we call it when a protein comes out of solution. So it precipitates. You go from having this nice clear solution where each copy of the protein has a nice full coat of water to copies of the protein kind of clumping together. And this causes them to come out of solution. They're not dissolved anymore, and instead you get this cloudiness. They might even settle at the bottom of the tube. This frequently happens if you are trying to change the conditions of the protein, such as through dialysis. Maybe you're removing salt and you remove too much, and the protein goes from being happy and soluble to being unhappy and in this precipitate. We'll talk about some things that you can do to try to avoid this happening, as well as how you can maybe rescue your protein if it does happen. So let's dive in. First, some quick tips, and then we'll go into the details. So avoid high concentrations. When a protein is aggregating, it means that proteins are forming bonds to one another. They're forming interactions with one another rather than forming these interactions with water molecules. And the more protein copies that there are, the more likely those protein molecules are to find another protein molecule, and the less likely they are to find a water molecule. So try to avoid those high concentrations, and you can dilute your sample down before dialysis if needed. Don't change things too drastically. Your protein was happy however it was, and so you might not be happy with the buffer that it was in. You might need to get rid of salt for your next step, say, but your protein was happy. And that the conditions that make your protein happy, if you go too far from those conditions, your protein is likely to get unhappy, and when your protein gets unhappy, then it's likely to aggregate. One reason that this could be is because you're going too low in your salt concentration. So as we'll get into, often we're doing dialysis in order to get rid of excess salt, such as before we do an ion exchange chromatography. So maybe you're going off of a nickel affinity column, and you've got a bunch of salt, you've got a bunch of imidazole, and now you want to go and you want to run an ion exchange chromatography column, which relies on using a salt gradient. And so you need to start with a low salt concentration. So you need to lower the salt, but you don't want to lower it all the way down because your proteins are going to need that salt in order to be soluble, as we'll get into. So don't go too low with your salt concentration. You also might want to do a dialysis to remove salt after that ion exchange chromatography. When you have a bunch of the salt, from having to compete off with salt, you're left with a bunch of salt, and it might be more salt than you want, so you might be wanting to remove that salt using dialysis. You might also, if you're just going straight from, say, a nickel affinity, sometimes that's enough of a purification, and so then you're just going to want to freeze it, but you're still wanting to get rid of all that high salt and that imidazole, and so then you might use dialysis in that case as well. And I'm talking a lot about dialysis. There are alternate methods. There are things like desalting columns, but again, you're going to be dealing with the same issues of needing to make sure that whatever you're putting your protein into is going to be a buffer that it actually likes. So don't remove all the salt if your protein can't handle those conditions, for example. Also, some people do a buffer. You can do a buffer exchange with the protein concentrator. So something like an Amicon spin filter, ultrafiltration device. I talk a lot more about those in another post. But something to be careful of with that is then you're increasing the concentration. And as we talked about, concentration can tend to make the proteins aggregate more and therefore increase the risk of precipitating out. So that might be a quicker solution, but it might not actually be a solution because it could be causing your protein to crash out on you. If you do crash out, we'll talk about some things you can do. One is that you can take a small portion and troubleshoot on it to find conditions that might make your protein happier. So you can gradually add salt, change the pH, maybe add a little detergent. Try these things out on a small sample of your protein, and then see if you can apply it to the entire solution in order to get things to dissolve. So let's start by backing up and talking about what we really mean by when we say something is soluble. What we mean is that every copy of the molecule has a full coat of solvent. And so in this case, our solvent is typically water. So we have some sort of aqueous buffer. So we have a water-based solution. And each of those copies of the protein has a full water coat when it's dissolved. In order for this to happen, it needs to mean that the water molecules like bonding to your protein as much as or more than they like bonding to one another, and that your protein molecules like binding to water more or at least equivalent to how they like binding to one another. If you tip the balance so that the water is less attractive and the protein's more attractive, then the proteins will bind to one another. And this can cause them to clump together. So we need to make it so that the proteins like the solution that they're in. However, we often don't like the solution that they're in. And so when we don't like the solution that we're in, say it has too much salt maybe, and we want to get rid of that salt, we often turn to a technique called dialysis. Dialysis, what it does is we stick our protein in some sort of little pouch. They have these like slidealizer, these nice cassettes that make things easier. Or you can make these pouches out of basically these dialysis membranes, and then you clip them at the top and the bottom, and you have a little foam thing, and you stick them in a big bath of the buffer that you want to change into. This membrane is special. It's going to let little things through, like those salt molecules, those salt ions, those charged particles, but it's not going to let your proteins through. You choose a membrane so that the pores are too small so that the protein is going to stay in there, but the little stuff can flow out. And this little stuff is going to flow out just through diffusion, this random movement of the particles. And eventually what's going to happen is you're going to get an even concentration of the salt inside and outside the pouch, because those salt molecules are just moving in and out. But there's more of them in, and so you're gonna get this net movement out of the pouch. And if you have enough liquid in there, you're going to make it so that you're basically diluting things out to almost none inside, especially when you then go and you change the buffer out. So you put it in a large excess volume of liquid, and then you're going to exchange it. And much more in dialysis in another post. Bottom line, at the end of your dialysis run, the solution inside the pouch should be the solution that was outside the pouch. And so when you're exchanging what the protein was in for this other buffer. And so you need to make sure that this other buffer is something that the protein likes, or else what you're going to get is you're going to get that protein crashing out. So you might go in with the all happy with your nice soluble protein. You stick it on overnight to do dialysis because you want to give it a lot of time for the diffusion to work. You come back in the next morning and this is what you see. And sometimes what happens is that you go to bed that night all excited because you had a really high concentration of protein. And then you come in the morning and it's like this. So that goes back to our thing about avoiding the high concentrations. That's often when you see this happen. And so one thing that you can do is to avoid those high concentrations and dilute your sample down before you do dialysis if it is a very high concentration. For something like that, you can just use a bigger pouch or something like this. It makes it a little bit of a pain if you have to then concentrate it later or something, but hopefully you can avoid it crashing out now. You don't want to change anything too drastically. So remember, it's going to get swapped into whatever buffer was in the outer chamber with your dialysis buffer. And you want that to be pretty similar to what you're doing. Ideally, it'll be the same as the buffer it's in currently, just without the component you don't want. So it'll be the same as your, say, elution buffer from your nickel affinity chromatography. If you're doing a nickel affinity before you go on and you do your ion exchange, your buffer could be like the same. It would just have without the imidazole and with a lower concentration of salt. Not no salt, but a lower salt. You don't want to go and change also like the buffer type. Like you don't want to go from like tris to heaps if you can avoid it. And you don't want to go from like a pH of 8 to a pH of 6 or something. Like don't make more changes than you need to make in order for things to be compatible with your next step. Or you run the risk of going too far from the conditions that you know that the protein likes. And so going back to this idea of salt, why do I keep going back to this thing of salt? Because that's often what we're doing dialysis for, especially when we're doing it before ion exchange chromatography. The basics of ion exchange chromatography is you have this column and it's filled with these little beads called resin. And those beads are going to be either negatively charged in the case of a cation exchange, or they're going to be positively charged in the case of an anion exchange. And so a cation is a positively charged thing and an anion is a negatively charged thing. Basically, what these beads do is you choose one based on the charge of your protein at that pH. Much more on this in another post. But your protein is going to bind to those beads, and then you're going to compete it off with salt. And so salt is going to be a neutral combo of a positively charged thing. So remember, that's a cation, and a negatively charged thing. So an anion. A salt is just a neutral combo of those. And when you stick them in water, when they dissociate, they break apart. So you would get a cation and an anion. And these are able to compete with your protein for binding sites onto that resin. And so what you do is you get your protein to stick based on the basis of being oppositely charged to that resin. And then you increase the salt concentration. And as you increase the salt concentration, those ions are going to compete off your protein. The more your protein was stuck to the column, so the more like oppositely charged it was to begin with, the more it'll be stuck, and therefore the more salt it'll take to compete it off. In order to get your protein to actually bind in the first place, you have to start at a low concentration of salt. And so you need to lower the concentration of salt. Typically, after your initial affinity chromatography step, you're typically at like a higher salt concentration. The higher salt concentration is good here for a few reasons, including that it's going to help you avoid non-specific binding. So when salt's around, it kind of makes this foggy atmosphere that's going to make it harder for molecules to kind of like find one another and bind to one another, because they're going to get kind of distracted by the salt. So when you use a high salt concentration in your affinity chromatography step, where you're using something like a his tag or something else, some other tag-based method to bind specifically to resin that has like a binding partner for that tag, say. You don't want things that don't have that tag to bind. And the more salt there is, the harder it is for those things to bind. And so you typically have a higher salt concentration in this affinity chromatography step. But then you have to dilute that down before you go on to that ion exchange chromatography step, at which you need to start at a low salt concentration, maybe something like 50 millimolar here, as opposed to, say, 300 millimolar of NaCl or something in your affinity chromatography step. And so you might need to experiment to see how low you can go without your protein crashing out. And you can take small samples and test this ahead of time if you're concerned. And we'll talk about what happens if it does crash out, how you can then add salt to try to get it back. But the reason why you don't want to go too low is because your proteins are going to rely on salt for making some of their interactions and for helping them make the proper interactions with water, avoiding improper interactions with other protein molecules or with parts of their own protein molecule that they're not supposed to bind to. So some parts of protein, some of the amino acids have charges. Most of them don't, or at least not full charges, but there are some that can be positively charged and some that can be negatively charged. And these ones especially are going to be influenced by those salts. The salts can kind of form a binding pair where you have a positive and a negative. And if the protein can't get that from the salts, then it's going to look and try to get that from another protein molecule or from another part of itself, and then cause the protein to misfold, which again makes it more prone to aggregation, or binding to another protein, gonna make it aggregate. And so if there's not enough salt, then that can happen. But you don't want to go too high from the salt on the salts either, because then that can actually cause your protein to crash out as well, because you're kind of taking all the water molecules away, because the salt is going to be hogging the water kind of. And so the protein is going to then crash out that way as well. So there's kind of like a sweet spot. This diagram is actually from when it was from a post on crystallography, which is why it looks kind of weird. But with crystallography, you actually use salt as like change the salt concentration in order to get proteins to try to crystallize. But I'm not going to go into that here. So I mentioned the nickel affinity chromatography, and so this is often used for his tag purification. where basically you engineer your protein so that it has a his tag on the end, which is basically a string of 6 to 8 histidine amino acids. And what these do is these bind specifically to nickel or to other metal cations that you have attached to the resin in the column. And what's going to happen is your protein that has that his tag is going to bind to the resin. You're going to wash off everything else, and then you're going to compete off your protein using imidazole, which is basically this histidine mimic. And in that way, you're able to purify your protein, but then you have a bunch of this imidazole and you have higher salt, because remember, the higher salt's going to help you not get those non-specific binding. And so that's often what you're trying to get rid of. But what can also happen is that also in that stuff that came out is a bit of the nickel. The nickel isn't permanently attached to the resin. In fact, you can actually strip it off and recharge the column. Add more nickel, or you can even use different metals and you can strip it and add a different metal like cobalt or something. The reason why you can do this is because the beads are actually attached to NTA or something like this. Basically, they're attached to something that can bite onto the nickel to bind the nickel, and then that nickel is going to bind to your protein. So the nickel is serving as this intermediary between the beads and your protein, but it's not directly like permanently stuck to the beads. And so this means that it can kind of leach off and it can come off with your protein. And what can happen then is if you have this nickel in your solution, it can actually cause the proteins to kind of aggregate together as well, like promote their aggregation, because now that nickel, instead of being bound to the column and the protein, can be bound to one protein and another protein. And so in order to kind of get rid of any excess nickel, what you can do is you can add EDTA. So you can add EDTA, which is a chelator. It's a metal biter. So we had chelator on the column, which was biting down on the metal. And now if we have free metal around, we can use this EDTA. It's going to bite down on that metal and hide it from your protein and get rid of it. And therefore, it's going to prevent the protein from aggregating, hopefully, at least in the case that the aggregation was caused by the EDTA. So you can add this to your elution to a final of like 0.1 millimolar. That should chelate any excess nickel, but you don't want to do that if your protein is like a metalloprotein and or it relies on metal, because then if you take that metal away, it can actually cause the protein to misfold and things like this. So those were tips to avoid the protein crashing out. So avoid high concentrations, don't make too drastic changes, don't go too low with your salt concentration, and potentially add EDTA to try to prevent the nickel from causing the aggregation. Now, say it does crash out. So first off, don't freak out yet. It often looks worse than it is. So a little bit of precipitate can look really, really bad. Like a little bit of the protein crashed out can make the whole thing look really bad because the solution gets really, really cloudy and gross. So first off, you want to see how bad things are. So take an aliquot, maybe take a mill, spin it down to collect the precipitate, and then measure the concentration of the supernatant, so the liquid, to see how much is still dissolved. Now, hopefully you took the concentration before you did your dialysis, and so now you can compare the concentration now to what it was before and see how much of it you've actually lost in the precipitate. And when I say lost, it might not be permanently lost, so we'll get to that in a minute. But first off, we need to assess the situation. And remember, when you're doing taking this concentration, that now you have to be using the new buffer that you're dialyzing into as your blank, because that should be what your protein is currently in. And so now what we can do is we can troubleshoot on a small portion to try to find conditions that might make the protein happier. So, but we want to do this on a small portion so that we don't mess up this giant portion, which makes things worse instead of making them better, or try too many different things and then not even know what exactly is in our mixture. So if you can take smaller portions and experiment in those smaller portions, and then you find something that works and apply it to the whole thing. To find something that works, so as I mentioned, like salt is often the biggest culprit. So what you can do is you can try adding salt stepwise. So maybe if you were at 100 millimolar salt, maybe go up to 150. And then if that doesn't help, go to 200. If that doesn't help, go to 250, that sort of thing. So basically, in order to see if it helps, what you can do is you can kind of take it and pipette up and down, make sure you resuspend any of the pelleted gunk, and then stick it on a rotating platform or a rotator. One of those end over end ones is really good in the cold room for half an hour or so. When you're working with proteins, you want to keep them cold. Unless your protein is like a weird case, the cold, it likes the cold, even if you don't like working in the cold room. It likes you working in the cold room, or at least watching from outside. So you see if this helps, and by then you can like respin it and then measure the concentration again to check and see if it's any better. If not, then raise the salt again. If that's still not working, there are other things you can try. And so maybe take a different aliquot and try changing the pH if you had changed it before. Or you can add a small amount of detergent in some cases. Different proteins will like different things, and you kind of just have to figure out what your protein likes. If you do figure out what your protein likes, you find conditions that help, then you can go and you can apply them to your whole protein solution. If you don't find a solution, it could be that your protein needs help refolding because it's stuck in like an energy minima. So basically, when molecules are at have a low what we call free energy, that's when they're most stable, and when they have a high free energy, they're the least stable. And if they're at a high free energy, then they're likely to go to a lower energy state. And when they're in that lower energy state, then it's harder for them to change state because they're happy as they are. Kind of like how if you had a bowling ball at the top of a hill, it has high potential energy, and it can fall down. And once it falls down, it's not very likely to go back up. But you could go and you can push it up the hill. And so what you can do is, in the case of your protein misfolding, it gets trapped at the bottom of the hill in a low energy state. The folded state is also a low energy state, but in order to get there, you have to push it up over the hill. And you can do this using various refolding protocols that help it escape from that from that minima with denaturients like urea or guanidinium chloride that are going to kind of help it unfold and give it a chance to refold correctly. And so check out protocols if you're interested in that. But know that not all proteins will be amenable to refolding, at least not correctly. So if you do have to refold, so maybe you get it to come back into solution, but it still might be kind of messed up. So try to verify that it's still functional if possible. So if you have some sort of, if it's an enzyme, see if it can still perform whatever enzymatic function it was supposed to do, or at least try to see if that it's actually nicely folded. A way that you can do this is by running a size exclusion chromatography, sometimes called gel filtration, column to look for a nice sharp peak. So this is another type of protein chromatography, and in this case, it's separating proteins based on their size. And what happens is that if you have a bunch of aggregate, that's going to come out in the void. Basically, it's just going to come out in the very beginning of the column. It's not going to go through the resin. It's going to kind of go around the resin. And it's going to come out in this clumpy stuff. And so if your protein's misfolded, you're probably going to get like a bunch of stuff in here. What you want to see is a nice sharp peak. This would indicate that your protein is nicely folded. If you get kind of like a weird broad peak, that could indicate that you have some folding proteins, some unfolded proteins, some misfolded protein, things like this. And then if you have stuff in the void, that could be like an aggregate. So this, if you see a nice sharp peak, though, this can indicate that your protein is at least folded correctly. But it might be easier to just start over and maybe test out dialysis conditions on small portions to find happy ones before you scale up. So hope that you don't have to go through this stuff. Hope your protein doesn't crash out on you. You can do things to try to keep it from crashing out on you. And you can do things if it does crash out on you. And hopefully this helps you understand what you can do and why you could do that.